I split my time between being a musician and being a mixing and mastering engineer. And when I mix and master, I very much come at it from a musician's perspective, which somebody who is often on the other end of the thing being recorded. So I think it gives me maybe a slightly different viewpoint on it. What I'm going to do today is show you a mix of Dwiki Darmawan's Paswar Kelwar album. It's a jazz album, and it won a bunch of awards. It won Downbeat Masterpiece Album of the Year, which is probably the most prestigious award in the States. And Dwiki is an Indonesian musician, amazing pianist. But this album was actually recorded in London, and all the other musicians are from the UK. And he came over here to record something with a bunch of British musicians. Indonesia, I went over there a couple of years ago to play, and at that time it was just behind the US in population. It will now have overtaken the US, so it's a huge country, and Jakarta is the second biggest metropolitan area in the world. I mean, it's big, and it's a thriving art scene and jazz scene. Dwiki is he's probably the best known jazz pianist in Indonesia. And this is an interesting album because it's a mixture of Western style jazz and some Indonesian influences with gamelan and other things. And I chose this particular track and this particular part of this track because it's extremely dense. There's a lot going on. There's a jazz quintet plus gamelan singing and violin and all kinds of things going on. And they're playing kind of full on. So I'm actually going to choose a section where it is pretty full on and show you what I did to try and make it so that you could hear everything, because that was the problem. Coming out of the studio and listening to it without, just with the faders up, it was just so dense you couldn't hear much, couldn't make out anything. So my task in this was to try to make it sound so that you could hear all the details, but also try to keep it as natural as possible. And those two things are kind of in opposition to each other in a way, but that's often the balance that you have to strike, is trying to get the best of both those things. So I'll play you, what I think I'll do is play you a bit of what it's like without any processing. The levels are approximately the same, panning's the same, but I'll play you a kind of before and after so you can hear what I started with and what I had to try and do. But just before I'll do that, I'll just explain this isn't actually the mix, because the mix was done in Pro Tools, and there's no way that Pro Tools is going to run on this machine with as many plugins. Logic is it's way more efficient, and I couldn't even get 2/3 of the plugins to run on Pro Tools, so I had to do it again in Logic. But it was, so it's a bit of a quick job, but it sounds similar to how it sounded. Okay, so I'll play a bit of it without any processing. You hear what we've got. I'm just going to forward to the end there because there's some acoustic guitar coming in, so you can hear what that's like. So when I heard this, I thought, it's really hard to make out the details, and there's a lot of really important things going on. The ride cymbal, for example, this is Asaf Circus on drums. He's an amazing, one of the best known drummers in the UK, jazz drummers. And what he's doing on the ride cymbal is incredibly important. It's a lot of intricate rhythms, and all the other players are playing off of that. So you really need to hear that ride cymbal, and I couldn't make out that at all. If I brought the overheads up, it just brought up too many other things, and it still wasn't happening. The bass just sounds kind of like, can't hear any articulation on the bass whatsoever. The acoustic guitar you can hear, but all the kind of quieter passages disappear. The snare, you can't hear any of the intricate snare stuff. Couldn't hear the kick drum pretty much at all. So, but this is pretty much the same levels. So I'll just play it again, just so you can have a bit of a listen out for those things and see what you think of it after I've kind of pointed out the things I was finding a problem with. So now I'll play you a bit of it after it's mixed. It's all hi-hat, but you couldn't hear the hi-hat on the first mix either. We've got these singers going on at the same time, and that was another challenge, which I'll talk about in a minute. See if I can find a bit of a ride cymbal, because that was a kind of important thing to try to get. I can't hear from back here very well. Can you hear the ride cymbal? You can? Okay, good. Because back here it's like I'm not really hearing the top end much. So what I'm going to do now is go through what I did, and hopefully it'll be helpful to see my working process. And I broke down what I'm going to cover under a bunch of headings which I thought were kind of themes which always come up for me. And the first one is creating space. The second one is making small little moves with a big palette of options, as opposed to bigger mixing moves with less options, meaning what I find works better is to have a big range of different plugins and do a little amount with each one rather than have a fewer amount and do a lot with those. And then organization is another thing which is important, especially these days, because of having to recall all the time. You've just got to have things super organized. And then gain staging and level matching, which are super important, even in a digital world. And I'll explain why that is. So I'm going to kind of hopefully use those to underpin the various things I'm going to show you as we go through here. So I'll start with creating space. I think I'll just talk a bit about that before I actually show you, just because it's the biggest problem, as you heard with the original mix. You just couldn't hear anything. And one of the reasons for that is because the way things are recorded now. I mean, I started back in the analog, I learned on analog gear, mixing to tape, mastering to tape, and it was all analog. And in those days, there was more money, a lot more money for recording. And that meant that people could record in nice sounding rooms, which meant that the spatial information was there in the recording. So all you had to do was turn the faders up. It already sounded good. It didn't sound crowded because your ear uses that spatial information to separate out the instruments in terms of not left and right, just left and right, but also front to back. And, you know, if two instruments are playing the same register, acoustic, bass, and piano, it's the reflections of those instruments that the ear uses to separate them out. And without that, it just turns into a muddy mess. So when things were recorded in really great sounding studios, you didn't need to really do that much. And reverbs back in those days also weren't really very realistic sounding. If you listen to a Lexicon 480, for example, although it's famous, it doesn't actually sound much like a real room compared to modern reverbs, like a Bricasti, which I know you've got one here. That sounds way more like a real space. And some other modern reverbs that also sound really great. And back in those days, it didn't matter because you already had that real sound in the room. And reverbs were used more as an enhancement effect. So, of course, they're still great, those kind of vintage reverbs for kind of an enhancement thing, for tonal enhancement, but they're not so great for replacing the lack of a room. And that's what we're presented with today. For example, this was recorded in your typical studio, which people can, what budgets can afford these days, which is a really small studio with small rooms. And as you may or may not know, if you have a small room, unless it's been really carefully designed, you know, custom built, with non-parallel walls and all that, you're going to get a horrendous sound. You're going to get flutter echo, you're going to get standing waves, space modes. It's just going to be a disaster. So what they do is they acoustically treat the walls and get rid of all that stuff, but you also have then no spatial information. You have a completely dead sound. The other problem with the small rooms is, like in the case of this one, the piano and the acoustic bass had to share a room, and the room was probably from that piano to here. So, you know, they both had to be in the same space. So they're going to leak a lot. The mic from the bass is going to be picking up the piano a lot, unless you get it incredibly close. So you have to close mic everything. There's no point in putting mics outside of the piano because it's just going to pick up the bass too much. So everything's close mic'd, and that also sounds kind of artificial because nobody listens to an instrument this close. So you get a sound of listening when you hear this close, which isn't that much like what it really sounds like. So that's why everything sounds so congested and on top of each other when I played the original mix, and it's very hard to pick things out. No spatial information for the ear to use. Everything's mic'd super close. So the challenge of modern mixing, which you really didn't have to worry about back in the old days, is to try to replace all that missing spatial information and to carve things around EQ-wise, which again you didn't used to have to do so much, so that you get a slightly more natural sound as if you were standing a bit further away from the instrument. So that's the starting point. So to create space, that's not so simple, because you can't just stick everything through a reverb, however good that reverb is. Say you had a Bricasti, which sounds very realistic sounding spaces. If you just put everything through that same, you choose a nice room patch or a hall, whatever it is that creates the space you want to hear the music in, and you put everything through that, it's not going to give you the information you need, because in a real room, you know, the bass is over here, the piano's here, and the reflections coming off of each of those against the walls and everything else are all different. But if you stick everything through a send into one hardware unit, you're not getting that. Everything's got exactly the same reflections and in exactly the same position within that space. So it doesn't help you separate things. It's still good, but I find that adding reverb, the same reverb to everything, doesn't actually give me as realistic a separation, especially front to back. So it's a matter of using a lot of different techniques to try to recreate that. Sometimes you just need to put one or two things into the reverb, and everything else doesn't really have reverb so much as just time-based effects like early reflections and delays and things to help position them within that space that's actually not on the instrument but on the other instruments, and it creates the illusion that everything's in that space and that this is a bit further away from you, this is a bit closer to you. And mixing is an illusion. Everything is illusory. So it's a matter of kind of trying to create a nice sounding illusion, basically. So that's a bit about this creating space. And now I'm going to go on to the showing you what I actually did. And that also brings me to the second section here, which is creating small moves with lots of plugins rather than doing a lot with fewer plugins. And it's also going to bring me to things like analog emulations, which is another kind of really, from my perspective, an important issue. And it's not just because I learned in the analog era, but just because they really do sound different, a lot different from non-analog emulations. And it isn't just adding saturation. There's a lot of other stuff going on in the good emulations that really are important, I find, to mixing, at least for the way I mix. So we'll start by having a look at start with the kick drum. And what I've got here is I've got an SSL E-series emulation. And the reason I've used this is because there's just something about the SSL E-series and the G-series too, but I find particularly the E-series, it just sounds amazing on drums. I don't really hardly use it on anything else, but on drums, it just seems to bring out what you want to hear in a drum. I don't know why. It's something to do with the way it smears the transients, because this is the thing about EQs. Different EQs do. It's not just about the curve, it's also about the time domain and how different EQs will smear the transients, how saturation is added in a nonlinear way across the frequency spectrum, and also down to how it's added as the volume changes and as transients move. All that, it's really complicated, actually. And that's what's great about a good piece of analog gear. It's also what's great about a good emulation. It gets a lot of that. And I find this one, it's a fairly recent plugin, and it was sold mainly by the idea that you can have your entire mix in this one plugin, or chunks of it anyway, eight channels at a time, and use and tweak them all at the same time. And I use it like that occasionally, but what I really like about it is it's just the nicest, for me, the nicest sounding SSL emulation, and I've got pretty much all of them. It just sounds superb on drums for me. So the kick drum, what have I done here? I've not done a huge amount because it didn't need a huge amount. What have I done here? I've added 6.5 dB at 2.3K. This is the kick drum, just to bring out the click a bit. This is the other thing about these SSL desks. You can put 6K on there and it doesn't sound like if you did that with a pure digital EQ, it would sound super EQ'd. But with these things, it just doesn't. It just brings out just what you're looking for, I find. And then I've cut a bit of the lower mid here because it was a little bit too boomy. It's not lower mid really, it's 450 hertz because it was getting a bit too boomy. And then I've added a bit of the low end here, 3 dB at about 50 hertz. And that's the kind of low end I wanted. I wanted that kind of solid low end, but it was a little bit too much sub when I did that. So I high-passed it here at the same amount. And I like to do that often, is to take a high-pass filter and set it at the same point that I've put the boost of the low end, because you get kind of a nice bump and you lose the sub information that on a kick drum like this in a jazz thing, you don't want that. It's not going to sound natural. And then this is another thing here. This is the microphone input, and it's just something about this plugin. If you just take it just off of 0, it just does a magic trick. It just gives solidity to it without you hearing any saturation. It's just really, really nice. So that's that. Now, I'll probably go through the others quicker than this, but just to kind of give you an overview. I'm just going to show you the first plugin in the chain here is this, and this is here because of gain staging. And it's super important to gain stage things right, because if you're using analog emulations, because a lot of them have been made so that the input signal should be within the usable range of the hardware, and it's been modeled like that. So if you're not in that usable range, you're either going to be getting stuff which they didn't model, because they'll probably model it up to the point where the meter hits the red, and beyond that they haven't modeled anything, probably, with a lot of them. So you're just getting stuff which isn't the analog model. It might sound good. I'm not saying you shouldn't do that. I'm just saying if what you're after is the kind of analog nonlinearity, you got to stay in the sweet range that they've spent all those months developing. So also, if it's too low, same thing. It's probably not going to be making full use of all the nice stuff that emulation can give you. So this is a really inexpensive VU meter, Klangheim. I can't remember how much it cost, but it's really not expensive. I really recommend you get this. It's got or something like this. It's got a trim, which means you can bring up the volume until the level is right. And where you want it to be is round about the 0 mark. You can't use your DAWs meters because they're peak meters, and they're not going to show you what you're after. What you're after is a kind of roughly an average. This isn't average exactly, but a VU meter. But it's quite a good approximation of the average loudness. And it's also what the hardware was built around. So it gives you a pretty solid sweet spot. So you want your loud parts to be around about the 0. It might go into the red a bit now and again, and it's going to spend some time down here. But the loud bit should be round about here. And that means that you're in the sweet spot for your plugin. If it's analog emulation. If it's not analog emulation, it probably doesn't matter. Most plugins, 32-bit float point, it doesn't matter. You can just slam it into the red. But for anything that analog, I really recommend that you do that. Okay, snare top and bottom, I've got a phase alignment plugin on those. I always try aligning the phase of the snare. Sometimes it improves it, sometimes it doesn't, but you've got the top and the bottom mic, and they're going to be out of phase. And you can try flipping the phase, but if you use a phase alignment plugin, it gets it potentially, well, it will get it more accurate. It doesn't necessarily mean it will sound better, but I always try it out. It usually improves the sound and gives more low end. Sometimes it doesn't. So I'll always stick them on there and then take it from there. Then the two snare top and bottom mics go into a subgroup here, an auxiliary channel. And here's a bit about the organization side of it. I'm sure you've probably been doing this anyway, always make things a certain color. Doesn't matter what it is, but drums for me are always blue, bass is always brown, because the color of a bass, acoustic bass is brown, and for no reason particularly piano is green, and so forth. And my aux channels, which you can also think of as a subgroup, they're a darker version of the same color. I also make them uppercase. And the whole idea of the name of uppercase, the whole idea is just at a glance, I can just see it really quickly and easily. If I have to open the session again later to make an adjustment, I just instantly know where I am. There's no thinking about it. It's just all there. And that's really important, especially because these days, clients expect you to recall mixes all the time. Again, like in the old days, that wasn't feasible unless you had a really good budget. You had to get a mix done in the time you had, and that was it. It was done. And you could write down all the settings if they wanted to pay for that time so that they could recall it, but recalling it was going to take a long time. They'd have to pay for that, and it never really sounded quite the same with analog gear. You put it all back, different day, different temperature, different humidity. You never get things exactly in the same place, and it all sounded a bit. So you end up having to remix a bit, and so it was done only occasionally. These days, it's just you're expected to, work on 4 or 5 projects at the same time, and you send it to the client. They send it around the artist. They send it around the rest of the band. They send it to the record label, or if there's a producer, the producer, you send it to the producer, and then they'll send it to whoever they need to get things approved, and then it comes back to you a week later, saying, yeah, we want this change, we want that change, we want this change, and so you've got to open it up and tweak it, and usually there's an iteration, a process of that, going around several times. Depending on the client, it can be 3 or 4 times, it can be many, many times, depending on what arrangement you've made with them financially in terms of what they want to pay for. So it's got to be super clear as soon as you open it, and as similar for one mix and another as you can get it, so that there's no kind of confusion.